The sun rises early over the Mojave Desert in August, bringing with it a heat that begins to radiate off the asphalt long before noon. In the quiet residential neighborhoods of northwest Las Vegas, the morning of the 14th of August 2023 began with the stillness typical of a summer Monday. Residents were starting their commutes, sprinklers were hissing on manicured lawns, and the wide, multi-lane avenues that grid the city were relatively open. For 64-year-old Andreas Probst, this time of day was a sanctuary. A man who had spent decades navigating the complexities and dangers of law enforcement, he had earned the right to these peaceful, solitary mornings. Andreas Probst was not a man who lived by accident. His life was defined by structure, discipline, and a profound sense of duty. Before settling into the quiet anonymity of retirement in Nevada, Probst had built a distinguished career in Bell, California. He spent 35 years in law enforcement, a profession that demands hypervigilance and the constant assessment of threats. He had risen through the ranks to become the chief of police in Bell, a role that required not just tactical acumen but administrative steady-handedness. Those who knew him described a man of integrity, someone who had dedicated the majority of his waking life to the protection of others. When he retired in 2009, he moved to Las Vegas seeking a change of pace, a place where the adrenaline of the job could be replaced by the rhythmic cadence of a bicycle pedal. Cycling was more than a hobby for the retired chief. It was a regimen. It kept him physically fit and mentally clear. On this specific morning, Probst was equipped for his ride, wearing a helmet and high-visibility gear, adhering to the safety protocols ingrained in him from decades of police work. He was riding north on Tenaya Way, a wide road with a designated bicycle lane. To any observer, he was the picture of a responsible citizen enjoying the fruits of a hard-earned retirement. He was exercising in his own lane, literally and metaphorically, posing no threat to anyone, disturbing no peace. He was a grandfather, a father, and a husband who had survived the streets of Los Angeles County only to seek tranquility in the desert. Miles away, in a parallel timeline that was rapidly converging with Probst's, a very different morning routine was unfolding. It was a routine of anarchy. Jesus Ayala, 18 years old, and Jzamir, 16, were navigating the same city streets, but their vehicle was not a bicycle, and their intent was not fitness. They were seated inside a Hyundai Elantra, a vehicle that did not belong to them. The car had been stolen, a common denominator in a spree of recklessness that had come to define the teenage duo's actions over the preceding hours. For Ayala and Keys, the morning of August 14 was not about the heat or the commute. It was a playground for predation. They were not looking for a destination, they were looking for targets. The atmosphere inside the stolen Hyundai was charged with a manic energy, fueled by a total absence of empathy. This was not a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. It was a crime of boredom, a nihilistic joyride, where the suffering of others was the primary source of entertainment. They were armed not just with a 2-ton vehicle, but with a smartphone, ready to document their exploits for an audience of peers who existed in the digital ether. The chaos had begun before they ever saw Andreas Probst. The stolen Elantra was already scarred from the morning's activities. The teenagers had been driving erratically, weaving through traffic, and looking for opportunities to inflict damage. Earlier in the morning, they had targeted another vehicle, a white sedan. In that incident, they intentionally rammed the car, a hit-and-run that served as a warm-up act for the violence to come. The driver of that sedan escaped with their life, shaken but physically intact, unaware that they had been merely a prologue. As the morning progressed, Ayala sat behind the wheel while Keys occupied the passenger seat. The dynamic between them was chillingly cooperative. There was no hesitation, no voice of reason suggesting they stop. Instead, there was encouragement. Keys held the phone, the camera lens acting as a filter through which they viewed the world. To them, the streets of Las Vegas were a video game, and the people on them were non-player characters, obstacles to be smashed for points or laughs. The disconnect from reality was absolute. At approximately 6 a.m., the Hyundai turned onto Tenaya Way. The sun was fully up, casting long shadows across the road. Up ahead, in the bike lane near the intersection with Centennial Parkway, Andreas Probst was pedaling steadily. He was alone on the road, his back to the approaching vehicle. He could not see the Elantra closing the distance, nor could he hear the conversation taking place inside it, a conversation that would later shock the conscience of the public. The video recorded by Keys captures the final moments of the convergence. The audio is clear, devoid of panic or anger. It is casual. As they spot the cyclist in the distance, the decision is made instantly. There is no debate about whether to strike him. The only question is the timing. Ayala, steering the stolen car, accelerates. The engine whines as the speed increases, the gap between the car and the bicycle closing rapidly. From the passenger seat, Keys zooms the camera in. He is ensuring the frame is perfect, that the impact will be captured clearly. The dialogue is sparse but devastating. Ayala asks if Keys is ready. Keys confirms he is recording. The phrase, "hit his ass," is uttered, a command and a declaration of intent that strips the act of any ambiguity. This was not an accident. It was not a driver losing control or blinded by the sun. It was a calculated execution performed for the amusement of two teenagers. Andreas Probst, disciplined and careful, maintained his line in the bike lane. He had no warning. He did not turn his head. He did not swerve. He was simply riding, perhaps thinking about the rest of his day, his family, or the simple exertion of the ride. He was a man who had spent a lifetime responding to calls for help, yet in his final moment there was no time to call for anyone. The impact was violent and immediate. Ayala steered the Hyundai sharply to the right, crossing the white line that separated the traffic lane from the bike lane. The front of the car slammed into the back of the bicycle. The force of the collision threw Probst onto the windshield before he was launched over the roof of the car and onto the hard pavement of Tenaya Way. The physics of the crash were brutal. An unprotected human body against a speeding vehicle leaves no room for survival. Inside the car, the reaction was not horror. It was mockery. As Probst lay dying on the asphalt, the car did not slow down. Ayala punched the accelerator, the Hyundai speeding away from the scene of the murder. Keys continued to film, panning the camera back to the shattered windshield, laughing at the damage done to the stolen car as if it were a minor inconvenience. They did not stop to check on the man they had hit. They did not call 911. They drove on, leaving a retired police chief broken on the side of the road, his life of service extinguished in a fraction of a second by a whim. The aftermath on Tenaya Way was one of tragic stillness. The bicycle lay mangled, a twisted frame of metal that was no match for the violence it had encountered. Probst was found unresponsive by emergency responders who arrived shortly after. Despite their efforts and transport to the University Medical Center, the injuries were catastrophic. The man who had survived decades of patrolling the streets of Bell had been killed not by a criminal he was arresting, but by a pair of joyriding teenagers who saw him as nothing more than a prop in their morning entertainment. For the community, the shock was immediate. The randomness of the attack was difficult to comprehend. Probst had no connection to Ayala or Keys. There was no road rage incident preceding the crash, no altercation, no words exchanged. It was a cold-blooded selection of a vulnerable target. The contrast between the victim and the perpetrators could not have been starker. A man who had dedicated his life to enforcing the law and maintaining order versus two young men who were actively dismantling it for sport. As the sun continued to climb over Las Vegas, the Hyundai Elantra was eventually abandoned, but the digital footprint of the crime remained. The video, recorded with such callous disregard, would eventually make its way from the private gallery of a teenager's phone to the eyes of investigators and the public. It would serve as the most damning piece of evidence, a first-person perspective of a murder that revealed the dark, hollow motivations of the attackers. But in those first hours of August 14, all that remained was the silence of a morning shattered and a family waiting for a husband and father who would never return from his ride. The collision of a life of service with a morning of chaos was complete, leaving a scar on the city that would not easily fade. The timeline of the violence that plagued the quiet residential streets of northwest Las Vegas on the morning of the 14th of August 2023 did not begin with the death of Andreas Probst. The fatal collision that captured global attention was merely the terminus of a chaotic trajectory that had been established hours prior. Before the sun had fully illuminated the spring mountains to the west, Jesus, Ayala, and Jzamir Keys were already in motion, navigating the sprawling suburban grid in a vehicle that did not belong to them. The events leading up to 6:04 a.m. were not a series of accidents or momentary lapses in judgment, but a sustained, escalating campaign of vehicular predation. The weapon of choice was a 2016 Hyundai Elantra, a sedan that had been commandeered not for transportation, but for the specific purpose of turning the morning commute into a violent spectacle. The acquisition of the vehicle followed a pattern that had become increasingly common in cities across the United States, fueled by online tutorials exposing security vulnerabilities in certain manufacturers' models. The theft itself was mechanical, almost routine. The steering column was compromised, the ignition bypassed, and the car was seized with little resistance. For Ayala, then 18, and Keys, 16, the stolen sedan represented a zone of immunity. Inside the cabin of the Elantra, the social contract that governed the outside world was suspended. They were insulated by steel and glass, moving faster than the waking city around them. The car was no longer a mode of transit, it was a battering ram, and the streets of the Centennial Hills area were transformed into an arena for their amusement. As they navigated the wide, multi-lane boulevards typical of the Las Vegas periphery, the dynamic between the two teenagers solidified. Ayala assumed the role of the pilot, his hands controlling the trajectory and speed, while Keys operated as the documentarian. This division of labor was crucial to the crimes that followed. The acts were not intended solely for the immediate thrill of the impact, they were performed for an audience. Keys held a mobile phone, keeping the lens trained on the windshield, ensuring that the windshield framed the road ahead like a cinema screen. The recording was continuous, capturing the mundane stretches of asphalt between moments of terror. The audio captured the casual, almost bored banter of two young men looking for stimulation in the pre-dawn gray. The first target of the morning was not a random vehicle, but a bicyclist. At approximately 5:30 a.m., nearly 35 minutes before they would encounter Andreas Probst, the Hyundai Elantra was traveling near Fort Apache Road and Washburn Road. The lighting conditions were still dim, the streetlights casting long pools of sodium orange glow on the pavement. A 7-2-year-old man was out for an early morning ride, a routine exercise in the cool air before the desert heat set in. He was riding correctly, maintaining his position near the curb, visible and predictable. To a normal driver, he was an obstacle to be passed safely. To Ayala and Keys, he was an opportunity. The digital record of this encounter reveals the premeditation involved. There was no swerving to avoid a hazard. The vehicle did not drift. Instead, the nose of the Hyundai was brought into alignment with the cyclist. The engine pitch increased. The 7-2-year-old victim had no warning. The sound of the approaching tires would have been indistinguishable from normal traffic until the final second. The impact was sharp and deliberate. The car struck the bicycle, sending the rider crashing onto the asphalt. Inside the car, the reaction was immediate. There was no gasp of shock, no slamming of brakes, no frantic discussion about checking on the victim. The atmosphere was one of triumphant amusement. As the 7-2-year-old man lay on the ground, suffering from injuries that would leave him battered but alive, the Hyundai accelerated away. The camera did not flinch. The laughter recorded on the video was light, unburdened by the gravity of having just assaulted a defenseless senior citizen with a 2-ton machine. They had bumped him, a euphemism they would use to describe these collisions, minimizing the potential lethality of their actions. This first strike served as a calibration. It proved that they could strike a human being and simply drive away. The city did not stop them. No sirens immediately wailed behind them. The impunity was intoxicating. Emboldened by the first hit and run, the spree continued. The Hyundai wove through the morning traffic, which was beginning to thicken as the city woke up. The driving style became increasingly erratic. Ayala drove with a flagrant disregard for lane markers and traffic signals, cutting across lanes and speeding through intersections. The objective shifted from targeting vulnerable pedestrians to asserting dominance over other motorists. The stolen car became a tool of intimidation. Minutes after striking the cyclist, the teenagers encountered a Toyota Corolla. This interaction was different. It was not a stealth attack on a bicycle but a confrontation with another steel cage. The details of the collision with the Corolla further illustrate the escalating recklessness. Ayala maneuvered the Hyundai to strike the other vehicle, a deliberate act of vehicular assault. The crunch of metal and plastic was just another sound effect in their ongoing production. The driver of the Corolla was left to deal with the shock and the damage, while the Elantra sped off, the occupants unbothered by the wreckage they left in their wake. The video footage from this period captures the sensory environment inside the stolen car. The dashboard was likely illuminated with warning lights, a common sight in cars stolen via the USB method, but these warnings were ignored. The windshield became a viewfinder for a perverse video game. Keys provided the commentary, urging Ayala on, validating the violence with laughter and encouragement. The synergy between the driver and the passenger created a feedback loop. Ayala performed for the camera. Keys rewarded the performance with engagement. The violence was the currency of their social bond. As the clock ticked toward 6 a.m., the sun began to breach the horizon, changing the lighting from gray to the stark, bright clarity of a desert morning. The visibility improved, making targets easier to spot. The Hyundai Elantra, now bearing the scuffs and dents of the earlier collisions, continued its prowl. They were not fleeing toward a destination or escaping a crime scene. They were hunting. The geography of the drive suggests a meandering path, a search for the next source of dopamine. They moved through school zones and residential arteries, the very places where the community felt safest. The psychological state of the perpetrators during this buildup is evidenced by their verbal exchanges. There was a complete absence of empathy. The victims were not people with families, lives, or physical fragility. They were non-player characters in a simulation. The 72-year-old man was just an object to be knocked over. The driver of the Corolla was just an obstacle to be rammed. This dehumanization was essential to the spree. It allowed them to laugh while sirens might have been distant in the background. It allowed them to keep the camera steady. By 6 a.m., the adrenaline of the earlier hits had not dissipated. It had normalized. The threshold for excitement had been raised. A simple bump was no longer enough. The driving became faster, the scanning of the road more predatory. They turned onto North Tenaya Way, a wide, straight road with designated bike lanes, a popular route for cyclists. The conditions were perfect for their purposes: clear visibility, long sight lines, and the presence of unprotected targets. The stolen Hyundai Elantra was now a weapon that had been tested and proven. The occupants knew what it felt like to hit a cyclist. They knew the sound, the jolt, the rush of fleeing. They had faced no consequences for the first hour of their rampage. This lack of resistance reinforced their behavior. In their minds, they were untouchable, the kings of the asphalt, writing their own rules as they pressed the accelerator. The engine whined as they picked up speed on Tenaya Way, the camera lens open and recording, ready for whatever or whoever appeared in the frame next. The previous victims were left behind in the distance, struggling with injuries and insurance claims, while the Elantra barreled forward, closing the distance toward the moment that would turn a crime spree into a murder case. The stage was set, the actors were in position, and the audience of one, holding the phone, was watching the screen. The stolen Hyundai Elantra was now a weapon that had been tested and proven. The occupants knew what it felt like to hit a cyclist. They knew the sound, the jolt, the rush of fleeing. They had faced no consequences for the first hour of their rampage. This lack of resistance reinforced their behavior. In their minds, they were untouchable, the kings of the asphalt, writing their own rules as they pressed the accelerator. The vehicle moved north along North Tenaya Way, a wide arterial road in northwest Las Vegas characterized by its long stretches of pavement and desert landscaping. It was just after 6 a.m. The sun had risen, casting a stark, clear light over the valley. Shadows were long, but visibility was perfect. There was no fog, no rain, and traffic was light, typical for a summer morning in the suburbs. The conditions offered no excuses for what was about to happen. Every action taken by the driver was deliberate, performed with a terrifying clarity of purpose. Inside the cabin of the Hyundai, the atmosphere was charged with a manic energy. Jesus Ayala sat behind the wheel, his hands governing the direction of the ton-and-a-half machine. Beside him, Jzamir occupied the passenger seat. The dynamic between them had shifted from car thieves to hunters. They were not merely looking for transportation or a joyride anymore. They were scanning the environment for targets. The earlier collision with the 72-year-old cyclist had not satiated their appetite for destruction. Instead, it appeared to have acted as a dress rehearsal, a proof of concept that emboldened them to escalate their violence. Ahead of them, the road stretched out, offering a direct line of sight. North Tenaya Way features designated bicycle lanes, marked clearly with white paint, intended to provide a sanctuary for cyclists separate from the flow of motorized traffic. In this lane, Andreas Probst was pedaling his mountain bike. At 64 years old, the retired police chief was maintaining a consistent pace, enjoying the morning exercise. He wore a red t-shirt and dark shorts, and he was equipped with a helmet, adhering to safety protocols. He was riding correctly, staying within the lines, his back to the approaching traffic as legally required. He had no way of knowing that the vehicle approaching from behind was not simply passing through but closing in. As the Hyundai closed the distance, the intent inside the car solidified. This was not a moment of indecision or a loss of control. It was a calculated setup. Keys retrieved his mobile phone. He did not pull it out to check a message or change the music. He lifted the device and activated the camera function, turning the lens toward the windshield. The objective was to document the act. The recording was not an afterthought. It was an integral part of the crime, transforming a brutal assault into content for consumption. The screen captured the dashboard, the dusty windshield, and the unsuspecting figure of Andreas Probst growing larger in the frame. The conversation recorded by the device reveals the synchronization between the two teenagers. There was no hesitation, no voice of reason suggesting they swerve away or slow down. Instead, the dialogue was a checklist for murder. "Ready?" Keys asked. The tone was casual, light, as if they were preparing for a prank rather than a homicide. The phone was held steady, ensuring the action would be centered. "Yeah," Ayala responded. His voice was calm, focused on the mechanics of the task. He did not lift his foot from the gas pedal. The engine's RPMs remained high, the car surging forward. The speedometer, visible in the periphery of the video, indicated they were traveling at a significant speed, well above the limit for a residential zone, but not so fast that they would lose control. They wanted precision. "Yeah, hit his ass," Ayala said. The command was explicit. It removed any ambiguity about the nature of the collision. This was not an accident waiting to happen. It was an execution being ordered. Probst remained unaware. The sound of a car approaching from behind is a constant for any cyclist, a background noise that usually signifies a vehicle passing to the left. He held his line, trusting the white paint and the social contract that drivers do not intentionally run down pedestrians. He was pedaling rhythmically, perhaps thinking about his route, his family, or the day ahead. The morning air was warm, the desert sky vast and blue. It was a moment of peace that was about to be shattered. Ayala steered the Hyundai. He did not need to make a sharp, violent turn. Because Probst was riding near the edge of the travel lane, a slight drift to the right was all that was required. The car crossed the white line. The tires hummed as they transitioned from the center of the road to the bike lane. The geometry of the collision was set. The front passenger side of the Elantra was aligned perfectly with the rear wheel of the mountain bike. The video captured the final seconds. The dashboard rushed toward the cyclist. Probst appeared to be looking forward, his posture upright. He did not turn his head. He did not brace for impact. He simply continued to ride, a silhouette against the morning asphalt. The impact was catastrophic. The Hyundai struck the bicycle with massive force. The laws of physics took over instantly. Probst was lifted from his seat, his body thrown backward onto the hood of the car and then up into the windshield. The glass shattered into a spiderweb of fractures. The sound of the collision, a sickening thud followed by the crunch of metal and plastic. The bike crumpled, its frame twisting under the weight of the sedan. For a split second, the retired chief was carried by the momentum of the vehicle that killed him. Then, as the car continued its forward motion, gravity claimed him. He was thrown over the roof or off the side, tumbling onto the hard pavement of North Tenaya Way. He slid to a halt, motionless, his injuries immediate and fatal. The red shirt, the helmet, the morning routine, all of it ended in a fraction of a second. Inside the car, the reaction was immediate and chilling. There was no gasp of horror. There was no slamming of brakes to check on the victim. The brake lights never illuminated. Ayala kept his foot on the accelerator, maintaining their speed as they sped away from the scene. The shattered windshield now obstructed their view, a jagged reminder of the life they had just taken, but it did not deter them. "Damn, that end got knocked out," Keyes exclaimed. His voice rose in pitch, not with panic, but with excitement. The camera was still rolling. He panned the phone back toward the interior, capturing the laughter that erupted between them. The tone was celebratory. They viewed the destruction of a human life as a spectacle, a successful completion of the challenge they had set for themselves. "Oh shit," one of them laughed, the sound echoing in the confined space of the stolen car. They were speeding north, leaving Andreas Probst dying on the asphalt behind them. The disconnect between the brutality of their actions and their emotional response was absolute. They did not see a father, a husband, or a retired public servant. They saw an object that had been struck, a score on a twisted game board. The car continued to accelerate, the engine whining as it pushed the damaged frame forward. The wind rushed through the cracks in the windshield. They checked their rearview mirrors, not to see if help was arriving for the man they hit, but to see if they were being pursued. Seeing no flashing lights immediately behind them, their confidence surged again. "You think he dead?" one asked, the question posed with a morbid curiosity rather than concern. "Yeah, he dead," the other replied dismissively. The video recording ended, but the flight continued. They were now fleeing a murder scene. The laughter subsided into a hyperactive planning of their next move, but the adrenaline of the kill remained. They had crossed a threshold on North Tenaya Way from which there was no return. The stolen Hyundai, with its smashed glass and dented front bumper, was now a marked vehicle, carrying forensic evidence of a homicide. Back on the road, the silence returned to the scene, broken only by the distant sound of the fleeing engine fading away. Andreas Probst lay on the side of the road, near the curb. The debris from the collision, shards of glass, pieces of the bicycle, plastic trim from the Hyundai, was scattered across the bike lane and the roadway. The sun continued to rise, illuminating the tragic tableau. Other motorists, who had been driving nearby or approaching the scene, began to react. Brake lights flared red as drivers slowed down, their minds struggling to process the sight of the body and the wreckage. The shockwave of the event began to ripple outward. Calls to 911 were dialed, frantic voices trying to explain that a cyclist had been hit and the car was gone. The calm of the Las Vegas morning had been violently disrupted. For Ayala and Keyes, the reality of the situation had not yet penetrated their bubble of invincibility. They were still in the high of the act. The concept of a life sentence, of courtrooms, of grieving families, was abstract and distant. In that moment, inside the Elantra, they felt powerful. They had acted with impunity. They had decided who lived and who died, and they had laughed about it. The recording stored on the phone in Keyes' pocket was a digital confession. It contained the premeditation, the act, and the lack of remorse. It captured the specific malice of the phrase, "hit his ass." It documented the clear weather and the straight road, proving that this was no accident caused by sun glare or a mechanical failure. It was a deliberate choice made at 6 a.m. on a Monday morning. As they drove away, putting distance between themselves and the crime scene on North Tenaya Way, they believed they had gotten away with it. They did not know that the very tool they used to glorify their crime, the video, would eventually become the anchor that dragged them down. But in those immediate minutes following the impact, as the speedometer climbed and the radio played on, They were just two teenagers in a stolen car, laughing at the havoc they had wreaked, completely detached from the devastation they had left in their wake. As they drove away, putting distance between the stolen Hyundai and the broken body of Andreas Probst, the silence returned to North Tenaya Way. It was a silence broken only by the distant, frantic sirens of approaching first responders. The sun continued to rise over the quiet residential street in northwest Las Vegas, illuminating a scene of devastation that initially appeared to be a tragic, albeit familiar, vehicular accident. Paramedics arrived within minutes. They found Andreas Probst unresponsive on the asphalt, his bicycle mangled nearby. Despite immediate trauma intervention and rapid transport to University Medical Center, the injuries sustained were catastrophic. The impact had been violent and direct. At the hospital, the trauma team worked against the impossible, but the 64-year-old retired police chief was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The classification at that specific hour was vehicular manslaughter, potentially accidental, complicated by the felony of fleeing the scene. Detectives from the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department's Collision Investigation Section took command of the site. The physical evidence told a confusing story. Standard hit-and-run investigations usually yield tire friction marks, skid marks, indicating a driver attempted to brake, swerve, or mitigate impact before the collision. On Tenaya Way, near the intersection with Centennial Parkway, there were no such marks. The debris field suggested a high-speed impact where momentum was maintained, not arrested. The bicycle had been struck from behind with significant force, throwing the rider into the windshield and over the roof of the vehicle. The officers began the procedural grid work of a homicide scene, though they had not yet labeled it as such. They canvassed for surveillance footage from nearby homes. They collected fragments of plastic and glass that did not belong to the bicycle. These fragments held the vehicle identification number hidden within their manufacturing codes, or at least provided the make and model. It was a Hyundai, likely an Elantra, dark in color. Simultaneously, the police dispatch network was processing a chaotic morning of reports that began to form a disturbing constellation. Hours before Probst was struck, officers had responded to other calls involving a similar vehicle. A report had come in regarding a 72-year-old man who was struck by a car while driving his Toyota Corolla earlier that morning. The driver of the offending vehicle had fled. Other reports of reckless driving and carjackings in the area began to merge into a single timeline. The stolen Hyundai Elantra was the common thread. By mid-morning, the investigation shifted from a static analysis of a crash site to an active search for the vehicle. The description of the car with its shattered windshield and significant front-end damage was broadcast to patrol units across the valley. The damage was distinct. Striking a human being at nearly 40 miles per hour leaves undeniable scars on a sedan. The breakthrough in locating the vehicle came quickly. The teens had not been masterminds of evasion. They were joyriders operating on adrenaline and impulse. Police located the battering ram, the 2016 Hyundai Elantra, abandoned near Lake Mead Boulevard and Jones Boulevard. The damage to the windshield was consistent with the debris found on Tenaya Way. Blood evidence on the vehicle confirmed the connection to the hit-and-run fatal. Officers set up a perimeter. The driver, 17-year-old Jesus Ayala, was apprehended shortly thereafter. At the time of his arrest, the full scope of the morning's events was locked inside the digital memory of his passenger's phone. To the arresting officers, Ayala was a juvenile delinquent caught in a stolen car, involved in a fatal hit-and-run. He was booked into the Clark County Juvenile Detention Center. The charges were serious failure to stop at the scene of an accident involving death, possession of a stolen vehicle, but they were framed around the concept of recklessness, not malice. The investigators believed they had closed the loop on a tragedy caused by negligence and panic. For weeks, the case existed in this state. The Probst family grieved a father and husband lost to what they believed was a senseless accident caused by a reckless teenager. The narrative was one of a joyride gone wrong. There was no public outcry regarding premeditated murder because the evidence of premeditation was sitting in a cloud account, unviewed by law enforcement. The investigation turned into a manhunt for the truth in late August. A student whose identity remains protected approached a school resource officer with information circulating in peer groups. A video was being shared. It was not surveillance footage, but a first-person recording. The video had migrated from private group chats to social media, gaining traction for its shocking content. Detectives watched the footage for the first time, and the complexion of the case changed instantly. The video, filmed from the passenger seat, did not show an accident. It showed a hunt. The audio revealed the occupants identifying Probst as he rode in the bike lane. It recorded the conversation between the driver and the passenger, a dialogue devoid of panic. There was no scream of, "Look out," no sound of braking. Instead, there was the chilling directive to hit his ass, followed by the sickening thud of impact and the laughter of the teenagers as the retired chief was launched into the air. This was no longer a traffic investigation. It was a homicide inquiry. The video provided the crucial element of men's the guilty mind. It proved intent. The driver, Ayala, was already in custody, but the passenger, the cameraman who had encouraged the act and laughed at the result, was free. The video became the primary tool for the second phase of the investigation, the manhunt for the passenger. The Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department now needed to identify the voice and the hand holding the phone. The footage offered clues, reflections in the dashboard, the angle of the shot, and the distinct voice of the accomplice. School resource officers and juvenile intelligence units analyzed the audio. The laughter and the cadence of speech were recognizable to those who worked within the local high school system. The passenger was identified as 16-year-old Jzamir Keys. A specialized task force was assembled to locate Keys. Unlike the initial arrest of Ayala, which happened in the chaotic aftermath of the crash, the apprehension of Keys was a targeted operation. Police obtained warrants for his arrest and search warrants for his residence and digital devices. They needed the phone. The video circulating online was a copy. The original file, with its metadata, GPS coordinates, and timestamps, would be the nail in the coffin for the defense. On a Tuesday in September, nearly 5 weeks after Andreas Probst was killed, police moved in. Jzamir Keys was taken into custody. He was found wearing a shirt that bore a haunting, ironic message, given the circumstances, a detail noted by arresting officers but irrelevant to the legal processing. What mattered was the seizure of electronic devices. Forensic digital experts immediately began the work of extracting data, looking to verify that the phone in Keys' possession was the device used to record the murder. With both suspects in custody, the investigation pivoted to the unification of the charges. The district attorney's office reviewed the new evidence. The hit-and-run charges were insufficient. The video removed any possibility of arguing that the sun was in the driver's eyes or that the car had malfunctioned. The laughter captured on the recording dismantled any potential defense regarding remorse or panic. The two teenagers were reunited, not in a stolen car, but in the legal system. The Clark County District Attorney made the rare and aggressive move to charge both teenagers as adults. The severity of the crime, a thrill kill documented for entertainment, demanded a departure from the juvenile justice system. The discovery phase of the investigation also uncovered the full timeline of that Monday morning. By analyzing the GPS data from the stolen Hyundai and correlating it with the video timestamps, detectives mapped a spree that lasted less than 2 hours but left a trail of terror. They linked the teens to the earlier hit-and-run of the 72-year-old man, confirming that Probst was not an isolated target but the final, fatal victim in a game of vehicular violence. As the case moved toward the grand jury, the video that had turned the investigation into a murder case was released to the public. The community's reaction was visceral. The image of the desert sun, the empty road, and the unsuspecting cyclist became a symbol of vulnerability. The laughter recorded on the track became the focal point of the prosecution's narrative. It was the laughter that stripped the defendants of the presumption of youthful indiscretion. The investigation concluded with a mountain of evidence that was rare for a homicide trial. Usually, prosecutors must infer intent from ballistics or circumstantial behavior. Here, the intent was narrated by the killers themselves. The discovery was not just of the suspects, but of the depth of their indifference. The police work that began with measuring skid marks that didn't exist ended with the preservation of a digital file that ensured the teenagers would not see freedom for decades. The transition from a traffic accident report to a double life sentence began with the arrogance of recording the crime. Usually, prosecutors must construct a narrative from fragments. They rely on tire tread depths, scattered witness testimony, triangulation of cell phone tower pings, and the inconsistent memories of bystanders. In the case of Andreas Probst, the investigation did not require the authorities to imagine the perpetrator's intent. The suspects had documented it themselves, capturing the transition from reckless driving to calculated homicide in high-definition digital video. This footage, found on the mobile devices of the accused, became the centerpiece of the state's case, transforming a tragic hit-and-run into an undeniable instance of open murder. The video, filmed by Jzamir from the passenger seat of the stolen Hyundai Elantra, provided a chilling first-person perspective of the crime. Unlike security camera footage or grainy surveillance from a neighboring business, this evidence carried the audio and visual clarity of a deliberate production. The recording begins moments before the collision. The camera is pointed through the cracked windshield of the speeding vehicle, capturing the bright morning sun and the desolate stretch of North Tenaya Way. The dashboard is visible, anchoring the viewer in the thieves' vantage point. Investigators analyzing the clip focused immediately on the dialogue. It was not the frantic shouting of panic, nor the confusion of a joyride gone wrong. The audio revealed a calm, coordinated exchange. As they approached Probst, who was pedaling in the designated bike lane near the curb, the conversation established premeditation. The driver, Ayala, asked a single, clarifying question, "Ready?" The response from the passenger seat was immediate. "Yeah," Keyes replied. "Yeah, hit his ass." The forensic value of these 4 seconds of audio was incalculable. It dismantled any potential defense, arguing that the collision was an accident caused by speed or distraction. The video showed Ayala steering the vehicle away from the center lane, crossing the white line, and targeting the cyclist. There was no attempt to brake. There was no swerving to avoid an obstacle. The camera held steady, framing the cyclist in the center of the shot, tracking him like a target in a video game. As the vehicle closed the distance, the recording captured the sound of the engine accelerating, confirming the driver's intent to maximize the impact. The moment of collision was recorded with brutal clarity. The cyclist, struck from behind, was thrown onto the windshield before tumbling over the roof of the car. The windshield shattered, spiderwebbing across the passenger side, yet the recording continued without interruption. What followed the impact was crucial to the prosecution's assertion of depravity. There was no gasp of horror. There was no silence of shock. Instead, the cabin of the stolen Hyundai was filled with laughter. The laughter, described by detectives as maniacal and devoid of empathy, continued as Ayala accelerated away from the dying man. Keyes turned the camera back toward the interior of the car, capturing their faces and the speedometer. The callousness displayed in those subsequent seconds provided a window into the psychological state of the teenagers. They did not discuss calling for help. They did not express fear of the police. They celebrated the hit as a successful maneuver, a thrill achieved. This digital trophy, intended to be shared among a closed circle of peers, eventually leaked, spreading across social media platforms with viral speed. The viral nature of the video complicated the investigation while simultaneously accelerating it. Before the police had publicly released the footage, it had been viewed millions of times on platforms like X and Instagram. The public outcry was immediate. The disconnect between the initial police report, which had clinically described a fatal hit-and-run involving a juvenile driver, and the visceral horror of the video, created a firestorm. The video stripped away the anonymity of the juvenile suspect label. It showed the world that this was not a traffic accident. It was a thrill kill. The Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department used the video to upgrade the charges, but the leak also meant the jury pool would be irrevocably saturated with the image of the crime. While the passenger's video solidified the timeline and intent of the murder, a second piece of evidence emerged that solidified the character of the primary defendant, Jesus Ayala. Following his arrest, Ayala was taken into custody and placed in a holding room. At 17, soon to be 18, Ayala operated under a misguided understanding of the juvenile justice system, a misunderstanding that he voiced freely to law enforcement officers and which was captured on body-worn cameras and interrogation room recording systems. The behavior of Ayala in custody offered a disturbing sequel to the video in the car. Most suspects, when facing a potential murder charge, display signs of distress, denial, or silence invoked by legal counsel. Ayala, however, appeared nonchalant, treating the detention as a temporary inconvenience. During the processing phase, he engaged in a conversation with an officer that would later be played in court to demonstrate his absolute lack of remorse. In the recording, Ayala is seen sitting loosely, unbothered by the gravity of the situation. He initiates a dialogue about the consequences he expects to face. "You think this is going to do anything?" he asked, referring to the arrest. He proceeded to lecture the officer on the workings of the legal system as he understood it. "I'll be out in 30 days, he boasted. "I'll bet you." The officer, maintaining a professional distance, allowed Ayala to continue talking. Ayala characterized the event not as a murder, but as a hit-and-run, a charge he seemingly viewed as a minor traffic infraction exacerbated by his age. "It's just a hit-and-run," he said, waving off the severity of the act. "That's a slap on the wrist." This phrase, "slap on the wrist," became the defining motto of the prosecution's character profile of Ayala. It revealed a mindset that viewed violence as a game with cheat codes. He believed his status as a teenager provided a shield, a legal loophole that would render him immune to serious punishment, regardless of the crime's brutality. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had navigated the system before and won. He did not know at that moment that the video filmed by his accomplice was already being analyzed by homicide detectives, or that the charge would not be a traffic violation but open murder. The juxtaposition of the two recordings presented a complete picture of the crime. The cell phone video provided the actus reus, the guilty act and the specific mens rea, the guilty mind at the moment of the killing. It proved the act was voluntary and intentional. The police interview footage provided the context of the defendant's morality. It showed that the laughter in the car was not a momentary lapse of sanity, but a consistent trait of his personality. He lacked the capacity to understand the value of the life he had taken, viewing the death of Andreas Probst only in terms of how it inconvenienced his own schedule. Forensic technicians delved deeper into the metadata of the video file found on Key's phone. The timestamp on the file aligned perfectly with the 911 calls received by dispatch. GPS data embedded in the video file placed the device at the exact coordinates of North Tenaya Way at the moment of impact. This digital footprint corroborated the physical evidence at the scene, the tire marks, the glass fragments, and the paint transfer on Probst's bicycle. There was no gap in the chain of custody. The device had gone from the suspect's hand to the evidence locker, preserving the integrity of the file. Furthermore, the recovery of the stolen Hyundai Elantra provided physical evidence that matched the video. The damage to the windshield and the A-pillar corresponded precisely to the angle of impact seen in the recording. Inside the vehicle, blood evidence was recovered that matched the victim, confirming that the car in the video and the car in police custody were one and the same. But it was the digital evidence that spoke loudest. The prosecution also utilized the audio from the video to identify the voice of Jzamir Keys. Voice analysis software compared the "hit his ass" command with recorded interviews of Keys. The match was conclusive. This linked Keys directly to the encouragement and facilitation of the murder. He was not a passive observer. He was an active participant who identified the target and gave the signal to strike. His laughter, distinct and recorded clearly near the microphone of the phone, served as his signature on the crime. The slap on the wrist commentary by Ayala was dissected by criminal psychologists during the pre-trial phase. It indicated a high risk of recidivism. A suspect who believes murder is a trivial offense punishable by a month in juvenile detention is a suspect who cannot be rehabilitated by traditional means. This assessment was critical in the state's successful motion to certify both teenagers as adults. The system that Ayala mocked was about to apply the full weight of adult statutes to him. As the evidence was compiled for the grand jury, the video was slowed down, frame by frame. Detectives noted that Ayala did not simply drift into the bike lane. The steering input was sharp and aggressive. The car's trajectory changed in a split second, cutting off the cyclist's path. The brake lights, which would have illuminated had Ayala tried to stop, were never engaged. The car's event data recorder, or black box, confirmed this mechanical reality: 100% throttle, 0% braking at the moment of impact. The mechanics of the car obeyed the driver's command, and the driver's command was to kill. The defense had little room to maneuver against such overwhelming documentation. They could not argue identity. The faces were on camera. They could not argue accident. The dialogue proved intent. They could not argue remorse. The police station tapes proved arrogance. The strategy shifted to minimizing the degree of culpability, perhaps arguing for second-degree murder or manslaughter, but the thrill aspect, the laughter, elevated the crime to the most severe category. The release of these evidence details to the public prior to the trial created a somber atmosphere in Las Vegas. The community knew exactly what had happened. They had heard the taunts. They had seen the arrogance. The slap-on-the-wrist comment became a rallying cry for the victim's family and supporters, demanding that the justice system prove Ayala wrong. The evidence demanded a sentence that measured in decades, not days. When the digital forensic report was finalized, it included a timeline of the teens' entire morning. The phone extraction showed that they had been recording various acts of recklessness leading up to the murder. They had sideswiped another car. They had sped through school zones. The murder of Andreas Probst was not an isolated incident, but the crescendo of a crime spree performed for an audience of social media followers. The phone was not just a communication device. It was the tool they used to validate their existence through infamy. Ultimately, the combination of the viral video and the recorded confession dismantled the presumption of innocence usually afforded to defendants. The video placed the jury in the passenger seat, forcing them to witness the murder through the eyes of the killers. The police interview placed the jury in the interrogation room, forcing them to hear the killer's indifference. Together, these two pieces of evidence ensured that the narrative presented in court was not a reconstruction of events, but a replay of reality. The silence of the desert road was broken by the engine's roar and the cruel laughter, and those sounds would echo all the way to the sentencing hearing. The investigation had closed the loop. The teenagers who killed for fun and expected a slap on the wrist had provided the very evidence that would lock the prison doors behind them for life. The evidence was static, frozen in digital files, but the defendants were dynamic, breathing entities that now had to face the machinery of the Clark County justice system. The transition from the interrogation room to the courtroom marked the beginning of a legal odyssey that would hinge not on the question of guilt, the video had answered that, but on the question of consequence. The first major legal battleground was the status of the accused. In the eyes of the law, Jesus Ayala and Jzamir were technically minors at the moment the bumper of the Hyundai Elantra made contact with Andreas Probst's bicycle. However, the brutality of the act and the cavalier nature of the recording triggered immediate motions to certify them as adults. The Clark County District Attorney's Office wasted no time. Under Nevada law, the severity of the charge open murder, coupled with the age of the offenders, created a pathway to bypass the juvenile system, which focuses on rehabilitation, and enter the adult system, which focuses on punishment. Ayala, at 17, was on the precipice of adulthood already. His transfer was a procedural inevitability given the charge. Keyes, at 15, presented a slightly more complex legal argument for his defense team, but the sheer malice documented in his own video recording eroded any leverage they might have had. The judge ruled that the sophistication required to steal cars, evade police, and document the rampage demonstrated a level of culpability that transcended juvenile delinquency. Both teens were certified as adults, stripping them of the protections of anonymity usually afforded to minors. Their names and faces became public record, and they were moved to the Clark County Detention Center to await trial. It was during the preliminary hearings that the narrative shifted from the horror of the crime to the shocking demeanor of the accused. Courtroom 8A became the stage for a display of callousness that stunned seasoned legal observers and solidified the public's perception of the teenagers as irredeemable. When Ayala and Keyes were escorted into the dock, shackled and wearing navy blue prison uniforms, the expectation was a demeanor of fear or perhaps performative stoicism. Instead, the gallery witnessed levity. As they sat behind the defense table, separated by plexiglass partitions, the two teenagers engaged in behavior that defied the gravity of the situation. They attempted to communicate with each other, covering their mouths to obscure their words from the microphones, but their body language was unmistakable. They were joking. At one point, Keyes looked toward the media gallery, where cameras were broadcasting the feed live to a horrified community, and flashed an obscene gesture. He smirked, appearing to relish the attention. Ayala, similarly, seemed unable to comprehend or respect the presence of the Probst family sitting just feet away, often appearing bored or amused by the proceedings. Andreas Probst's widow, Crystal, and his daughter Taylor sat in the front row, forced to watch the architects of their misery giggle as if they were in a school detention hall rather than facing life in prison. The images of the teens laughing went viral, mirroring the virality of the murder video itself. This time, however, the public response was not just shock at the violence, but fury at the lack of remorse. The narrative of the laughing killers took hold in the press, creating a prejudicial atmosphere that the defense attorneys found nearly impossible to mitigate. The defense strategy was dismantled by their clients' own behavior. Typically, defense counsel in capital or life sentence cases rely on humanizing the defendant, painting a picture of a troubled youth, a lack of guidance, or an underdeveloped frontal lobe incapable of fully grasping consequences. But every time Ayala or Keyes smirked for the cameras, they reinforced the prosecution's narrative that these were not confused children, but sociopathic predators who viewed the destruction of life as entertainment. The judge admonished them to maintain decorum, a warning that seemed to barely register with the teens, who seemed to view the court as another stage for their infamy. Behind the scenes, the legal maneuvering was intense. The prosecution, armed with the viral video, the confession, and the courtroom behavior, held all the cards. They announced their intention to seek the maximum penalty allowed by law. Since the Supreme Court had ruled the death penalty unconstitutional for offenders who were minors at the time of the crime, the ceiling was life in prison without the possibility of parole. However, recent legal precedents regarding juvenile sentencing often mandated that a meaningful opportunity for release be considered. This created a narrow negotiation window. The defense teams for Ayala and Keyes recognized that a jury trial would likely be a disaster. Showing the murder video to 12 jurors was bad enough. Showing them the footage of the defendants laughing at the victim's family in court would ensure the harshest possible sentence. The goal shifted from acquittal, which was impossible, to damage control. They sought a plea agreement that would secure a fixed date for parole eligibility, rather than leaving their fate to the discretion of a judge after a guaranteed guilty verdict. For over a year, the case ground through the procedural delays typical of the American justice system. Motions to suppress evidence were filed and denied. Competency evaluations were ordered and returned, confirming both teens were fit to stand trial. The Probst family attended every hearing, a silent, stoic presence that stood in stark contrast to the antics of the defendants. Crystal Probst became the face of dignity and the face of depravity, refusing to engage with the teens' provocations, waiting for the final word. By late 2025, the deals were finalized. Both Jesus Ayala and Jzamir Keyes agreed to plead guilty to murder and a litany of related charges, including attempted murder and grand larceny, stemming from the morning crime spree that preceded the fatal collision. In exchange for the guilty pleas, which spared the family the trauma of a full trial and the gruesome replay of the evidence, the state agreed to drop the without parole stipulation, offering a chance, however, distant of freedom. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for a cold morning in November 2025. The courtroom was packed. The atmosphere was heavy, the air thick with the anticipation of closure. When the defendants entered, they were noticeably different. 2 years of incarceration had changed them. The smirks were gone, replaced by the blank, hardened stares of young men who had grown up in a cage. The reality of their situation had seemingly finally settled in. The proceedings began with the victim impact statements, the moment the legal system yields the floor to the bereaved. Taylor Probst approached the podium, clutching a prepared statement. Her voice was steady, forged in the fire of 2 years of grief. She did not address the judge initially. She turned her body slightly to face the defense table. She spoke of her father not as a retired chief, but as a man who had spent 35 years enforcing the law, only to be killed by those who held it in contempt. She described the void left in their family, the empty chair at holidays, the silence of a phone that would never ring again. Then, she addressed the courtroom antics directly. She reminded the court of the laughter that had compounded their pain. She described the cruelty of watching them joke while her family mourned. She called them cowards who found joy in destruction, asserting that their behavior proved they were monsters, not children. Crystal Probst followed. Her statement was briefer but devastating in its precision. She spoke of the cowardice of the act, striking a man from behind, a man on a bicycle, while sitting in the armored safety of a stolen car. She dismantled the joyride defense, categorizing the event as a thrill kill. She asked the judge to ensure that the community would remain safe from them for as long as the law permitted. When it was the defense's turn, the attorneys made their mandatory pleas for leniency. They cited the defendants' youth, their chaotic upbringings, and the influence of peer pressure. They argued that the Ayala and Jzamir Keys, standing in the courtroom in 2025, were not the same impulsive boys from 2023. They asked the court to look at the potential for rehabilitation over the next 2 decades. Ayala and Keys were given the opportunity to speak. Their statements were brief, mumbled, and largely scripted. They offered apologies that fell flat against the weight of the video evidence. The lack of visible emotion during their apologies contrasted sharply with the genuine anguish of the Probst family. The judge, having heard the arguments, prepared to deliver the sentence. The judge noted that while the law required him to consider their age, it did not require him to ignore the nature of the crime. He highlighted the video recording as the defining factor. He stated that this was not an accident caused by panic, but a performance filmed for an audience. He reprimanded them for laughing in his courtroom, noting that they had treated the judicial process with the same disdain they had shown for the victim's life. For Ayala, the driver who turned the wheel and used the vehicle as a weapon, the sentence was life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 20 years. The judge emphasized that as the primary aggressor, his culpability was absolute. He would be nearly 40 years old before he could even ask a parole board for release. For Jzamir Keys, the passenger who encouraged the act and filmed the death of Andreas Probst, the sentence was life in prison with the possibility of parole after 18 years. The judge rejected the notion that he was merely a bystander, ruling that his encouragement and filming made him a principal participant in the murder. He would be eligible for a hearing in his mid-30s. The sentences were handed down with a finality that seemed to suck the air out of the room. There was no laughing now. As the bailiffs moved in to handcuff the men and escort them back to the holding cells, there were no obscene gestures, no posturing for the cameras. The reality of life had arrived. They were let out through the side door, leaving the Probst family in the quiet wake of the verdict. Outside the courthouse, the media scrum awaited. The microphones were thrust toward the family, but the mood was not one of celebration. There is no victory in such cases, only the cessation of legal combat. Crystal Probst stood before the cameras, the desert wind blowing strands of hair across her face. She expressed gratitude for the sentence, but acknowledged the permanence of her loss. The legal chapter was closed. The fight for adult certification was won, the laughter in the courtroom had been silenced by the gavel, and the teenagers who killed for fun were now inmates who would grow old in the concrete confines of the Nevada correctional system. The viral fame they had sought had cost them their lives, leaving them with nothing but time to replay the video in their minds, over and over again, in the dark. She expressed gratitude to the prosecutors who had successfully argued that the callous nature of the crime transcended the defendant's youth. Speaking to the assembled cameras, Crystal Probst articulated the profound dissonance that had defined the entire legal process. The contrast between her husband's lifetime of public service and the trivial, fleeting motivation of his killers. She noted that while the court had delivered the maximum allowable punishment under the constraints of Nevada law and recent juvenile justice reforms, there was no sentence that could reverse the physics of the collision or the silence of the last 2 years. The finality of the court's decision provided a procedural conclusion, but it offered little in the way of emotional resolution for a family whose patriarch had been stolen for a laugh. The sentences handed down inside the courtroom minutes earlier were specific and severe, designed to ensure that the transition from adolescence to adulthood for Jesus Ayala and Jzamir would occur entirely within the confines of the Nevada Department of Corrections. The judge, in delivering the ruling, had dismantled the defense's attempts to frame the incident as a youthful error of judgment. Instead, the court cited the video evidence filmed by Keyes and directed by Ayala as proof of a depraved heart. Ayala, identified as the driver who intentionally steered the stolen Hyundai Elantra into the bike lane, received a sentence of life in prison with the possibility of parole only after serving 20 years. Keyes, whose laughter and encouragement were immortalized in the footage that led to their capture, received life with parole eligibility after 18 years. These terms meant that the defendants, who had entered the system as teenagers, would not face a parole board until they were men approaching middle age. The judge had emphasized that eligibility did not guarantee release, marking a definitive end to the bravado that had characterized their early court appearances. The smirks and obscene gestures directed at the Probst family during the initial arraignments had vanished by the time the final gavel fell. In their place was the stark realization of a future measured in decades, defined by the regimented monotony of high desert state prison, rather than the chaotic freedom of the streets. The viral fame they had sought by uploading the footage of the murder had ultimately served as the architect of their incarceration, providing the state with the indisputable evidence of intent required to secure life sentences. With the legal proceedings concluded, the focus of the public and the press shifted from the perpetrators back to the man whose life had been extinguished. Andreas Probst's legacy was not defined by the brutal seconds of his death, but by the 35 years of service that preceded it. A former chief of police for the city of Bell, California, Probst had spent decades navigating the complexities of law enforcement, working to protect communities often plagued by the very type of senseless violence that eventually claimed his life. He had retired to Las Vegas seeking peace, swapping the stresses of command for the meditative rhythm of morning bicycle rides. Those who knew him described a man of integrity and quiet strength, a father and husband who had survived the dangers of a career in policing only to fall victim to a random act of thrill-seeking. In the weeks following the sentencing, the community of Las Vegas solidified its memorialization of the retired chief. The section of Tenaya Way where the collision occurred had been transformed into a permanent site of remembrance. A ghost bike, a bicycle painted entirely white, was chained to a post near the impact site, serving as a somber sentinel against the desert landscape. It stood not only as a monument to Probst, but as a stark reminder of the vulnerability of cyclists and the devastating consequences of vehicular violence. The ghost bike became a gathering point for the local cycling community, which organized memorial rides tracing Probst's usual route. These rides, often attended by hundreds of cyclists wearing ribbons in Probst's honor, reclaimed the asphalt from the violence of that August morning, replacing the memory of the stolen Hyundai with the collective hum of bicycle tires and the shared solidarity of the riders. Taylor Probst, the victim's daughter, became a vocal advocate for victims' rights and tougher penalties for violent juvenile offenders in the wake of the trial. Her testimony during the sentencing phase had been instrumental in highlighting the human cost of the crime, dismantling the narrative that the defendants were merely misguided children. In the aftermath, she continued to speak publicly about the need to recognize that age does not always mitigate malice. Her advocacy ensured that her father's name would be associated not just with a tragic death, but with a push for a justice system that prioritized the safety of the community and the anguish of surviving families over the rehabilitation of offenders who displayed no remorse. The final measure of justice, however, was found in the silence that descended upon the case as the media vans packed up and left the courthouse. Jesus, Ayala, and Jzamir Keys were processed out of the Clark County Detention Center and transferred to the state prison system, their names fading from the daily news cycle. They were stripped of their individuality, reduced to inmate numbers and housing assignments. The notoriety they had chased by recording their crime dissolved into the anonymity of the penitentiary. There were no more cameras, no more social media uploads, and no audience to perform for. For the Probst family, the legacy of the sentencing was the closing of a chapter that had been written in grief and anger. The life sentences offered a guarantee of safety for the community and a validation of the severity of the loss. Andreas Probst remained a presence in their lives, not as a victim on a viral video, but as the enduring memory of a man who had lived with purpose. As the sun set over the Red Rock Canyon, casting long shadows across the valley, the ghost bike on Tenaya Way gleamed in the twilight, a silent testament to a life well lived and a justice finally served. The noise of the crime had been silenced, leaving only the enduring dignity of the man who had ridden his bike that morning and the family who carried his memory forward.